proposition, we think that peace agreements are largely about the continuation or the non-continuation of war. Therefore, how we propose to set up this debate is to, during every conflict, after every full year of conflict within a conflict, to hold a national binding referendum asking the public whether they agree with a peace agreement to be set up or agree with the continuation with war. In addition to, if the leaders of a country in conflict want to arrange a peace agreement, then obviously there is also a binding national referendum to see if the public agree with that peace agreement. But what we primarily think this is about war. On side proposition, we think that in the world today, war is often used where it is not the most beneficial way of solving conflicts between countries. We think often war leads to a lot more destruction, suffering, and antagonism and tension between countries, which we think could actually be solved in diplomatic ways and ways that doesn't cause as much suffering. Therefore, we think that it's primarily better if we have a world with less war, where there is less conflict, and where there is less suffering for people. This leads me on to the fact that a lot of governments use war for political gain. We think a lot of governments feel that it makes them seem powerful to their electorate. It makes them seem decisive and strong if they go to war rather than necessarily taking a route which may not be as quick or may not be as violent or may not be as immediate, but actually after this, but which actually does achieve the aims that they want in a more peaceful and less destructive way. Clarification quickly.
Are you going to do what the motion says and actually have the referendum on the peace agreement itself?
Yes, I said that. I said we're having one after every year of conflict and a referendum on the peace agreement if that's separate. I've already said that. Anyway, so yes, we think wars are primarily bad at achieving aims because of the what I've explained to you. And we think through holding this referendum on every year of conflict and to do with peace agreements, it forces the people in charge of countries to actually think about the effects that this war and this conflict is having on their own citizens and necessarily on the citizens of other countries and how this war is actually perceived. And we think this is actually going to be a lot beneficial in the long run for the amount of suffering and tension that a lot of these wars cause. We think that because politicians are often very politically motivated and don't actually think about the suffering that's occurring, often this is overlooked, and through this, because it's such a binding referendum, it obviously looks very bad if what politicians are doing actually doesn't adhere to what the people say in the referendum. Obviously it's binding, so then they're obviously forced to change their course if the people vote to go against the status quo, which the politicians would otherwise pursue. That's very bad. That's something that the politicians don't want to happen. Therefore, we think it's more likely that politicians will actually do what's in the favour of the people of their nation, and rather than just pursue the war for political gains. Because we think often leaders of countries use war as an emergency power, an immediate thing that they do in the heat of the moment, and it's not necessarily thought through as to what the actual benefits and disbenefits are. We think when they have this pressure of this binding referendum on them to think about the issues that are actually involved in the war and actually affect the people in their country, we think it's a lot more likely that they'll actually think about war with the actual aims which will reduce as the harm that comes with war, which is purely fueled for political gains. Yes, obviously these politicians are held to account through elections and everything, but it's not as regular as holding this referendum as we propose, which happens every year of conflicts. And also we think elections offer a different kind of pressure to this referendum, which is purely about the war issue. That holds a lot more accountability to politicians upon the actual issue of war, and forces them in a lot more direct way than just necessarily accountability in election, where there are lots of issues, not just about conflict and war. That's why we think it's more effective in that way. To do with legitimacy, we think often the public will towards a war often turns the other way before the war actually ends, and this is often very destructive. Once politicians get a country into a war, often it's very hard for them to get out of it because they think it looks politically disadvantageous and they look less strong if they get out of it early. See Vietnam, Afghanistan and Iraq. We think that this is a bad thing because this often means that they stay in the country for too long and cause more destruction, more death, not only to their own soldiers but also to people in that country, and we think like if they're faced with this pressure of like a binding referendum, it will force them to actually think about those issues and like in a more immediate way, rather than just kind of like thinking about like their own like kind of distant like political motive, which isn't as binding as these referendums, and will actually like make them kind of act in a more like beneficial manner to those people who are like suffering under the war. Like we think also that like because the ending of war often comes like after public perception turns against the war, like that's often a very long process. And what we're doing by holding these like referendums that actually call the politicians to account and like force them to think about the issues, we're actually sort of shortening a process that will happen anyway. But it's just like when you shorten a process, you're just stopping like all of the like harms and destruction that come from such a long-term conflict. Yes.
What happens if one side wants the peace agreement and the other side says we don't want the peace agreement?
So like the side is, what do you mean?
One side votes yes in the referendum, one side votes no. What happens?
We think there are like after that there are probably like means of like negotiation like between the countries to like sort out something that may matter between them. Like I'm sure there's a way of sorting that out. But we think what the most important thing is like that they can be like that these referendums like put the pressure on the politicians to actually like think about what's happening in these issues, to stop the suffering and like the problems that come with these wars, and like actually force them to be more accountable than they are in the status quo, because it's very, very easy for these like elite politicians not to think about the actual issues on the ground and the citizens that are like suffering in these wars. And like by holding these referendums, it will actually force them to think about that and actually make like a beneficial solution happen a lot faster than it would have otherwise, when they're not faced with the issue of like ending a war. Like often these conflicts can continue without people actually thinking like about ending it at all, because it just becomes a status quo. And we think these referendums will like make it be a much more immediate consideration for the politicians to think about, and will be beneficial in the long run for everyone. So urgent to propose.
Thank you for your remarks, and I will now pass the floor to Zach.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, two things in today's speech. Firstly, about how we think that this means that this is going to make the public perhaps more likely to vote against peace than their government would do. And then secondly, we're going to talk about the issues surrounding full disclosure, why that might be necessary, why if it is given that would be bad, why if it isn't given that would also be bad, and how sort of disclosing certain things to the public might be problematic. Because similar to open government, we agree that like peace is an objectively good thing, and we think that we need to have the most likely route to peace. Before I do that, 2 points of rebuttal. So we basically get from the mechanism that's going to be every year, during the conflict. Mr. Speaker, we think that the public will always vote no in these situations for two reasons. Firstly, their own government's propaganda that will be being portrayed during the war that is dehumanising the enemy and making these people think they really don't want to be in a peaceful negotiation with the opposition that has been so thoroughly dehumanised. And secondly, because we think they'll vote no because of a sense of nationalism that has been given by the government, because governments tend to tell their public that they're winning the war during the war. The public probably wouldn't want to vote no in the wouldn't want to vote for peace in this situation, so no thank you, if they think they're going to win. We think this is problematic. The second thing, we hear this idea, so that it might be, in response to my PO idea, it might be bad for government to pull out of war. What we think from this is that if it's bad for a government to pull out of a war, but the people want the government to pull out of the war, the government will collapse the peace deal, as has been happening in Cairo between Israel and Palestine, because one government is like, yeah, let's have a peace deal, and the other government that isn't so keen on it. Right? Given that peace agreements will have to have the mutual cooperation of both governments, we think that this is very problematic. So we think essentially what their mechanism boils down to, no thank you, is when a peace agreement does come about, then the public will have some form of referendum on it, because we don't think that a public sort of a public initiated peace agreement will actually achieve peace for those reasons. So on why, no thank you, on why we think when the agreement is put before the public, as was clarified after my clarification, they are more likely to vote against peace. Two reasons. One, they are the most affected group by it, and therefore the most radicalised. And secondly, they are the ones that are most prone to in-war propaganda and nationalism. So on the idea that they are most affected, we think they're the most affected, and what this means, because like, they're the ones like actually out in the streets when government is like in like government, and wars tend to not actually affect government, but the actual individuals more themselves. See like the amount of civilian deaths as opposed to government deaths, which are in the Israel-Palestine at the minute. Thank you. Right, so we think that when they're the most radicalised, they turn to radical groups. They don't necessarily look for peace. They don't necessarily look for the solutions. See in Gaza where people at the minute who would not have traditionally supported Hamas are now turning to Hamas as a means of, well, at least they're fighting against the enemy that have come into my street and killed my children. And when they turn to those metrics, when they turn to those groups that are defending them, they are less likely to vote for peace when they think that these people are the ones that are defending them, and these people don't want peace, these people are okay to keep fighting. We think that they're also most prone to in-war propaganda and nationalism because of this, because they're able to be radicalised in that way, because of the things that have happened to them, because they tend to go into poorer economic situations during a war because a war is costly. Right, so we think what this does is it creates resentment to the enemy, a resentment that makes you not want to stop fighting them, no thank you, because you hate them so much more than you, because your emotions are running so high, you're necessarily less able to think in a logical way during that, but it may actually be better for you for the war to stop, but because you hate them so much, you don't vote, no thank you, you don't vote to stop the war. So why do we think that government is more likely to vote for peace? And after this, I'll talk about why we can't risk it because like peace is actually good. So why is a government like more likely to vote for peace? Three reasons as to why war is bad for government and it would want peace. One, it is costly. It drains your economy. It drains the situation of people living in there. And then when the war is over, people so it's a very costly thing. Secondly, you get lots of death, and that's generally bad for a government in the long run. So it's probably more likely to vote for peace to stop the death, because a government can necessarily think a little bit more logically, because it is a little bit less emotionally attached to the situation, no thank you, because it is not so much out on the streets and acting and being directly affected in the same way that individual people are. And lastly, because it creates poor living conditions for people. The issue is that in war, public don't blame their own government and won't hold their own government to account. They actually hold the enemy to account, and this is why we think that the governments should be in their thing on the whole. So we think that when Open Gov say yes, peace is an objective good, what we think then on this is that when we put it into the hands of the public and they are more likely to vote for not peace than a government is more likely to vote for peace, that is probably something that we should be supporting. I'll take a PI quickly.
Couldn't the public vote for a government which would, under certain conditions, support peace, but just be opposed to those particular conditions?
Well, then that is an argument for, in some conditions, to have a referendum, not for all referendums in all conditions to be absolutely binding, which don't have, that's what you have to argue for, as that's the motion. So, like, on the second point about issues surrounding full disclosure, like, there are two options. You either, as the government, do give full disclosure to the public, or you don't. Issue, if you don't have full disclosure, is that you're lying to the public on an important issue that will come out later and will be problematic for you. We think that's probably bad for everybody involved. Secondly, we think on the idea of partial disclosure, we think it's quite likely that a government is going to present half-truths that further dehumanise and further the enemy and further radicalise their own population, making them more likely to vote for the continuation of war. Note, we think this is particularly the case if the government is winning. The government is likely to tell the public that it is winning, don't vote to end the war because we're like 30 seconds from victory. And then even if they do give full disclosure, I think the issue there is that you have uncomfortable truths that come out and public guilt becomes a thing. And you're more likely to sort of vote to continue because it increases hostility to the other side because news is multinational, Mr. Speaker. So for the reasons that whatever happens with full disclosure, the public's more likely to leave, more likely to continue the war, and because in general it's just more likely to continue the war, we think that is bad. We are proud to stand in opposition.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to Ben.
Gone are the days, Mr. Speaker, when wars had truly victorious winners who were able to claim they had defeated an evil enemy that was causing terror to the world, and that they managed to achieve all that they aimed for in this warfare, and that they've been a truly successful venture. The reality is that war is an incredibly poor tool for the governments and for states to use in an attempt to enforce geopolitical power. War is incredibly ineffective in achieving their aims, as been noted by recent wars have simply not achieved their stated aim. Let's look at Afghanistan, for example, not exactly successful. Israel-Palestine, literally nothing has been achieved in years of conflict with thousands of deaths. These are simply not been in any way successful outcomes for even any of these governments initiating warfare. I think on our side of the house, you get less wars, and the wars that do occur are much shorter, because at the moment the public realise the reality that these wars have been unsuccessful, and all that's happened is they've lost their friends, their family, and the people around them to this conflict. I think these people are going to be actively encouraged to leave, and they're going to be more likely to want to leave than the government would be. So let's talk about warfare and the population in the information age, They tell us that, well, look, let's face it, the governments are just going to send out loads of propaganda saying that that all their enemies are not human, or they're inferior to them. That's going to make them really angry and they want to continue warfare. Now this just isn't how things have played out in reality, This just isn't what populations get through due to the fact that there is simply more than one. Well, you don't just have the voice of the government anymore. We live in an age where people are interconnected primarily via the internet, and people have direct access to both sides of conflict and to the true reality of these warfare, where they can see they are simply fighting against another nation of human beings, and they can see the suffering they're causing and the suffering that's causing on their side of warfare. I think that makes it fundamentally impossible for governments to truly dehumanise their opposition, or at least to do so with the vast majority of moderate individuals within each nation. Except that some extremists will buy into this, they probably bought into that in the first place. That doesn't really matter. We don't think those people represent a significant enough majority for them to then pass through, for them to pass this referendum and allow the war to continue. I think the reality is the vast majority of individuals understand that warfare is between two states of humans, and that is going to continue to be the case with the modern age. That's just the way people are able to communicate with states. That's why you don't get people who are aggressively radicalised permanently if they were originally moderates. Even in Israel, we see people forced to support Hamas. It's not because they hate Israel and want it to be wiped off the map. It's simply because Hamas are building schools in their area. The legitimate government can't be able to do so. They have to do that simply because it's their only option. People haven't all been entirely turned towards extremist views. They simply have to defer to that party because it's the only resident power left. And at the point where you can't have a peace agreement, and they haven't been willing to accept the peace agreement, you can't have an option. You have to support whatever exists in that area. So let's talk about public peace deals and the reality of politics and why governments are far less likely to want peace than the public might do. So warfare has differing costs for different individuals versus governments, right? For politicians, the active cost is likely to be quite low among their supporters that allow them to continue to be profitable, right? So I will take Tony.
Okay, on your last point, aren't more people going to turn to extremism when you open up the national discussion to populism rather than trade negotiators whose job is to make peace in a pragmatic way?
No, because people are going to have, people aren't going to be radicalised if they have an amount of information in addition to their state propaganda. On your side, you said that the states just kind of have propaganda. That's how it works. That's how they're allowed to continue wars, right? Presumably, that occurs under your status quo, and that's a political pressure on you to do it. The fact is that when you have people that have an active choice that they are choosing to make, they get to directly make the decision. Which is that the extreme minority that are quite vocal in political discussion are important to parties getting elected, do not have the overall majority that allows them to pass through this referendum. So let's talk about the reality of political parties under most systems, right? And why that makes them more likely to want to continue warfare rather than having a peace agreement, right? So we think that parties tend to take broad ideological stances, and that due to the fact that not everybody votes, they tend to focus on more extreme views than they would otherwise, because it allows them to galvanise voters into voting more aggressively and to attending more elections. Right? We think that people who have strong views in certain directions are more likely to vote, and that's why parties tend to gravitate towards those views. So what does this mean? Right? This means that in a relative minority in terms of the entire national politics, maybe 30% of the population that are extremely in favour of warfare, are able to change the entire narrative of national politics by supporting a single party which is pro the current war engagement. Right? That allows them to disproportionately engage the nation in a warfare that the majority of the populace don't agree with. Like, no, how this 70% of the rest of the populace want to end the war, want to see their brothers and their sisters and their friends to stop dying in a foreign nation. Right? But no, this galvanised 30% is able to, through the political system, through the indirectness of this level of democracy, right, is able to gather themselves around a single party and to split the vote of the remaining people between people who simply don't vote and other parties that might not agree with the same topic. No, thank you. Right. Secondly, why is this likely to be more likely for politicians to support warfare? Because politicians really are generally cared about being elected. Right? There are multiple reasons that you end up getting elected. Right? You need a lot of money to run politics. You need a lot of political influence to do so. Right? This tends to be overwhelming from the wealthy classes. Right? See how a lot of politicians tend to favour their policies towards the rich, even in favour of the minorities and the poor, because it's simply more politically advantageous to do so because you are able to gather wealth from the rich. So, Donald Trump's incredibly powerful in America, right? Despite only being a single person. Right? This means that because the wealthy and the upper classes lose significantly less from warfare, since it's not their children that are being sent out to fight, it's not their friends that are dying on the battlefields, right? It's not their friends that are being attacked in civilian areas, because chances are they're not going to live in areas that might be at risk because they're rich and they can afford to move around and do all these things. Right? Now, it's really the rich who don't see the full costs of war, but who do gain some of perhaps the potential benefits of war, of seeming to be a powerful political state, or from getting to supply during a wartime time, which may not be beneficial. Right? Regardless, there are limited costs to these area groups. These are groups increasingly where, particularly the far right politics, the right-leaning parties that are going to support the continuation of war will tend to gravitate towards. So there's an increased incentive for those parties to not support the peace agreement, whereas the public would do. So, Mr. Speaker, because I think warfare has proven to be fundamentally ineffective, because we think that parties are far less likely to support an end to warfare than collectively individuals are, we urge you to propose.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to Hannah, who goes the first half of the debate.
Panel, members of the House, I'm going to talk to you on 2 points today. Firstly, on how it allows government to avoid responsibility in actions of war. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the timing that they've brought us and why both cases, in terms of yearly and also in terms of when an agreement is being made, it's bad. Firstly, a lot of rebuttals. So we get Israel-Palestine brought up from the previous speaker. They seem to think that the reason war has continued is because, the public or whatever. No, the reason why the war in Israel and Palestine has continued is because, by the way, there have been lots of agreements in 1993 and 2000, per example, right, is because they have failed over major issues like Jerusalem, like settlements, right? It's a very, very simplistic view that says just because the government doesn't want to, right, particularly when you actually have pro-peace parties in the current coalition in Israel, and particularly when Netanyahu himself has said that he supports a two-state solution in 2009, we think it's a very simplistic view to hold that you just like, it's just not happened because there hasn't been a referendum for the thing. In terms of propaganda, right, this absolutely happens in this day and age that you said it doesn't, right? Even if the government aren't responsible for themselves, like Google guesses what you would like. So unless you want to muck up Google by like Googling opposing things, right, it's probably only going to give you things that you agree with, which means if you have a history of liking certain things, it's probably only going to give you those things. So we think that actually, yeah, it's absolutely the case that you can be taken on board by war propaganda. In terms of a couple of things the previous speaker said, firstly they said the government doesn't dehumanise the enemy. Like when Netanyahu makes Palestinians look inferior by saying they aren't deserving of their own states and Hamas calling Israelis rats, who've been driven to the sea, they absolutely do dehumanise in times of war. Secondly, you talk about galvanised groupings of people, galvanised by this dehumanising propaganda. People don't think rationally about war. So let's go on to my first point in terms of how it allows government to avoid responsibility. Oh my god, I'm talking really fast, I'm going to slow down, right? So war and peace are tough decisions for anyone to make, and we believe that this is a decision that should lie exclusively with the government of the country. I'll take one of you after my first point's done, right? Well, why? Well, because we elect them to make tough decisions, and we give them a mandate to solve any problems that might arise during their term. And war is like a major thing of this. Now, you want it yearly, right? We think that this option removes the responsibility for anything that may happen from the government, right? So if anything goes wrong afterwards, right, or for, say, the country says, no, we don't want to make a peace agreement, the government can put the responsibility on the people. We think given that governments are elected to make decisions for us, we think the responsibility in something so major should absolutely lie exclusively with the government. We think they shouldn't be given an out. We think this is giving them an out. We think that this is a major problem. So let's move on to the cases you gave us, but firstly I'll take a POI, closing.
Yeah. Would you say that the Palestinians should accept a peace agreement that doesn't resolve the issue of the refugees enough? And would they be not accepting it just because of propaganda?
Yeah, so that's the problem under your side, right? Because what happens is you have an agreement yearly, and then the sides say, like, the Palestinians have been told that they have to make an agreement, right? So then the PLO are like, oh, okay, I have to make an agreement. So they will make concessions that they don't need, that they don't want, and that will not be popular in their country. I'm actually going to expand on this now, right? So in the case if there is an agreement in place when you're holding this referendum, right, this is an extremely volatile situation, and we have a lot of problems with that. Jack talked to you about the problem with disclosure, right? I'm going to talk to you about back channels, right? So peace agreements often happen in back channels, and they often happen like without the knowledge of the government. See, like pre-Oslo, when you had a lot of talks beforehand, so that like they could actually even come to the table, right? Because really, see Northern Ireland, right, where Sinn Féin and the Unionists were like hiding their talks through like the UK government, so that like they can't be seen as negotiating with terrorists and such forth, right? Every major peace deal that's happened in the past couple of years, past like 20, 30, whatever years, right, this has happened, right? So by unearthing the fact that an agreement is even happening, you're already causing major problems, right? Because presumably you need to be telling the public, and you need to be preparing for the public the first time that agreement's happening, right? But also then if you've got an agreement on the table, right, you expose it even more, because you mean that particularly like in cases where governments may have conceded on certain things to make peace happen, right, you therefore give chance for like lobbying to happen before the deal is done. You also mean that people may actually even not vote for peace because they don't like the cases that are held out in this agreement, right? I think that's very, very problematic. Secondly, right, so even if you've not set peace and it's just this yearly one, right, Jack alludes this in a POI, right, if the other side don't want an agreement, the government will be forced to make concessions they don't want to do in order to make the peace the public wants. So, like, for example, like Israel may have to concede on Jerusalem, which caused the failure of Camp David in 2000, because the public has told them that they need to make peace, and we think that's just problematic. It's also problematic in terms of like why countries go to wars, and also problematic in terms of what the public want. So thirdly on this, right, it's better that agreements can be made where there's ripeness for peace. So in order for a sustained peace, in order for the agreement to be successful in a country, right, you need it to be a stage at the time is right. I'll give you an example of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, right? That's made in 1998. A few years later, it fails because Stormont is suspended and it has to be revised in the St Andrews Agreement in 2005, right? And because of certain issues that hadn't been solved, right? We'd say that in that case, therefore, in 1998, we were not ripe for peace, right? And the Good Friday Agreement did not solve what it should do because we had to go to another agreement, right? So eventually St Andrews meet and Sinn Féin accept the police and so forth, everything happened, right? So what happens on your side is that if you make this, you have this yearly referendum that says we have to make peace. They have to go and make peace preemptively, right? And then what happens is that the agreement either fails or it's just not what it should be in terms of sustaining it. So it fails immediately, or you go back to war in the case of Good Friday in less than 10 years' time, right? So what happens under our side, right, is if you let the government deal with it, the government who have been in these talks, the government who also know the ins and outs of everything, if you're not giving them full disclosure, if you are, then you've got a lot of problems in terms of the agreement, as I told you, right? Then the government can go into an agreement when the time is right and therefore have an agreement that will happen. Also in 1993, the time wasn't right. Camp David in 2000, it wasn't right in Israel. We think that the government are in the full mind to decide when the time is right. We think therefore having a referendum yearly is also as problematic as having one when there's an agreement. So what have I told you? Well, firstly, I've told you about how it allows the government to avoid responsibility. This is generally a problem, given that a war is a big decision. We think that they shouldn't be able to just hand that on the hands of the public. We think we should be able to blame Tony Blair for being a war criminal. And secondly, I've spoken to you how the timing of your agreements mean that we can have a lot of problems in terms of sustained peace and in terms of the agreement as a whole. And for these reasons, vote opposition. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, we believe in opposition that the idea of referenda and the idea of giving everybody a say makes peace agreements much more difficult to arrive at and will lead to worse outcomes in the long run. And even once the peace is eventually established. And I'll get to reasons why that is the case. But first, a fair amount of rebuttal to both teams, actually. So, firstly, the MEC is ridiculous. It's unclear how a warring state would be able to hold a nationwide referendum. The government speaks as if it's always, peace agreements are only required between two states, but many cases, and many of our examples which I'll bring to you, are civil wars which require a peace agreement. So even if you have the capacity to organize a referendum, which is time and money, when it's national wars, how much harder is that in a civil war? But suppose it is an international war, then if two countries have sufficient channels of communication to coordinate an annual peace treaty, which they can then put to their population, then we contend that they already have the means to use diplomacy to solve their issues. And we don't think there is any situation in which this MEC could ever exist in a realistic world. And finally, the government didn't respond clearly to what would happen if one side agreed a unilaterally binding peace agreement is a meaningless thing. If one side stops, it's unclear what happens. Secondly, the government opening says that there'll be fewer and shorter wars. We contend that that's not the case. And in particular, I'm going to show why wars will actually be much longer with a much more inefficient method that they have of reaching a peaceful agreement. And even if, however, it leads to shorter wars, which we completely object to, that in fact we argue that a premature exit from war can be just as bad. And a clear example is a small but militarized minority, such as the Lord's Resistance Army, may not accept that the war is over, even if the majority accepts that the war is over, and they can fester in exile, as they have in the real world, which is a place far removed from what Gov thinks might exist. Now, from the bottom half, the bottom half fails to understand what's going on in a war. During a war, emotions are running high. But the nature of negotiations means that no one is completely happy ever. Concessions have to be made, and I'll deal with that in more detail. If the member of government claims that people want peace, we agree, but what we say, let's give it to them and work from there. Peace always benefits immediately, and if the long-term, if all these harms that the member brings, that when people are unhappy with the terms of agreement, extremism and violence, exist even more so under their situation, because in the government model, the population wants peace, so the extremists, the people who start out as extremists, are going to be minorities and driven to all the things that these guys talk about because their voice isn't heard. And this is, so these harms still exist under these conditions, and we say that it even worse if you don't like the terms of the condition, much worse when referenda are binding, as it is in the MEC, because you can't renegotiate the terms of the agreement. We put it to you in opposition that it is much better to get a peace, even if it is suboptimal, because it is much easier to renegotiate the terms of a peace once the peace has happened. Now, in our extension, I will talk about the following. We contend that this is a much less efficient way to achieve a peace, because a successful negotiation requires four things: empowered negotiators, leverage for peace brokers, deadlines and timelessness, and unpopular concessions on both sides. And we will show that none of those things are possible under this model. So it is under empowered negotiators, it is it's much easier to disengage if you can claim that you don't have the power. It is much easier for you to shrug your shoulders and say, geez, I really agree with you guys, you've got a good point, but my people don't want it, and so negotiating peace, it becomes impossible when you you go away and you come back and say, sorry, it removes the immediacy, it lowers the stakes, it removes the agency, and it removes the incentive to fully engage. And a very instructive example is the recent peace negotiations between the Sudanese government and Sudanese rebels, which led to the creation of South Sudan. The biggest problem that they had in those negotiations was that the Sudanese government delegation could not make a single decision without going back to the president and asking for permission. And when the negotiator agreed, he was removed by the president. What happened to change the situation? Well, leverage for peace brokers. So in many of these conflicts, these are internationally mediated, and the peace brokers have to have direct influence on the negotiators. So they demanded that you have empowered negotiators. They took them off-site to Addis Ababa, and they removed, by giving these people power, they removed the ability to say, geez, it's not my fault. And remember that negotiations are always messy. This is realpolitik. And in the case of, I'll take you in a moment, okay? In the case of the Sudanese negotiations, which are led by the Japanese, in fact, what they did was they had the negotiations on a dance floor in Addis Ababa in a very hot room and said, look, we're not leaving here until the negotiation is reached. And that was direct realpolitik influence, which allowed eventually this peace agreement, which stopped the killing of thousands of people to happen. The third thing that you need is deadlines and timeliness, which is clearly not possible if every negotiation is, here's a possible peace agreement, let's go and organize an enormous nationwide referendum, and then, people didn't agree, let's then ask everyone which bits they didn't agree with, and then come back to the negotiation table. There's no possibility for that. And it's important to remember that no agreement is ever perfect. You have to decide when an agreement must be reached, because that breeds pragmatism. And we contend it's better to have peace now and come to terms with the treaty details later. A good example of this is the outrage of the Good Friday Agreement. So because we think it's impossible, the next impossible, and because we think that this makes it harder to reach peace, which is the most important thing, we strongly, strongly oppose.
phone's running out of battery. Sorry, I have two main points I'm going to bring to you on how we won this debate. One, I'm going to show you how we demonstrated that negotiations are ineffective under this model and will not lead to good peace agreements. Furthermore, we will show you how the national discussion is unhealthy when it's opened up to extremist ideologies. First, some rebuttal. I'd like to start with pointing out two inconsistencies between top half and bottom half on my other side, one of which is pretty much a knife, in that they say in any war, if top half say, in any war we're going to have two things. We're going to have referendums on peace agreements and we're going to have annual referendums. What the bottom half go and say is, well, no, we're going to have annual referendums when it's appropriate, when it's an intervention, and then we're going to not have them when it's a unilateral war. Reminder that the whole in a conflict between two states, the annual referendum is basically contradictory in that sort of if it's binding, but it can't be binding if the other side doesn't agree. So then you just lay down your arms and die. The other inconsistency is that they basically admit in bottom half is that people Netanyahu's constituents probably agree with him. So they'll probably agree with any peace treaty he brings to them. Great. Why bother with a referendum then? Why waste all that time when people are dying because you haven't stopped the war? Why do that when they're basically probably going to agree anyway? And if they don't like it, they can vote him out. All right. Okay. So so war is bad is something that comes out of top half a great deal. So yeah, we agree war is bad. You know what else is bad? Waiting for wars to end. Negotiations take a really long time. Years, in fact. You know what else takes a really long time to set up? No matter how logistically fast you are, because referendums. Because you need to give time for each side to do their arguments. There. So that's like adding another 6 months to the conflict probably. Yeah, another 6 months, another 1,000 dead. Brilliant. Right. Okay, have I got any more rebuttal left? Okay, yeah, the idea that it's not mutually exclusive for power to be put in the negotiators, but also power to put in people. No, because the negotiators now have to ratify, the negotiators have to be ratified by the people. So they don't have the power to promise things, because then the people decide. This is e.g., any promises that say the UN, that the US makes at the UN on climate change, are undermined by the fact that it has to be ratified by their government. So actually, they're not promises. They don't have power. Okay, I'll go on to that in my main point of substantial on how. Okay, so what we get from the other side is that, the populists will put pressure on people to make peace. This moves towards peace because people like peace. Yeah. Okay, so we get that. Okay, premature exits, as we mentioned, are actually often more damaging. The point about the Lord's resistance army is a premature peace basically meant that a large group of that country rejected it entirely, and it leads to sort of, imagine pulling out of Iraq without actually setting up a proper Iraqi army. Guess what? You don't need to imagine it. Right, okay. So, yeah, so on the idea that, okay, so on to my main point. So what we demonstrated, one, okay, negotiators. Okay, so what negotiators need is the power to promise things in the room, the power of leverage over people, the power to say, this will actually happen, because no one's going to agree to something that they don't think is actually going to happen. Right, so the example my partner brings you is Sudan, where when there was not power invested in negotiators, the negotiations failed because the negotiators weren't trusted. In a sensitive situation where people have to sacrifice on both sides, they need to know that their sacrifices and the other people will follow up on their sacrifices. This doesn't happen when then they have to go out and campaign for those things to be ratified. Also, time. As I said, referendums take a long time. You can't avoid that. The thing about peace negotiations is they're so time sensitive. The situation changes in Gaza every single day. So imagine a 6 month sort of negotiation. Not right now. Okay. So what happens is, by the time you've ratified this referendum, suddenly the situation has changed entirely. Not referendum, peace agreement. The situation has changed entirely. All of a sudden, this peace agreement is no longer valid. But it's binding. You can't change it without another bloody referendum. So the cycle goes on, and you're always about 6 months behind reality, which is just too much in international relations. Okay, so what do we want? We say that this will bring about bad peace negotiations, simply because there won't be power, there won't be trust. Everything will have to predict what happens in 6 months' time. You can't do that. We won that point. Okay, the idea of discussion. So this wasn't. I'll take you in a bit. Okay, so this wasn't really engaged with on the other side. Is that sort of like they say that this is good because we force discussion, we force a national discussion. But we say like I'll give you some points on why that national discussion isn't actually healthy once I've taken the POI.
So, sorry. We feel that completely that in the majority of cases, then the referendum is going to be accepted, and we feel that the points at which it isn't going to be accepted are exactly where the debate lies.
Okay. So in those situations, in those situations, we're willing to say that occasionally people will not be happy with referendums. We say on the comparative, the ability to act that I brought you in that last point, on the comparative, that's better. If you already accept that in the majority of situations, the public will be in favour of a peace negotiation. As they said on top bench, people like peace, people don't like wars. That's good. So, yeah, right, okay. So, what we brought is these negotiations are technical and complex. Peace negotiators are experts in what they do, and these are not things that can be boiled down into a simple set of points. These are not ideology-based policies. What these are complex legal documents which are rarely satisfying and often pragmatic. We have them because the alternative is worse, not because they are perfect. So when you have to campaign on that immediately opens itself up to populist groups and minority interests who do not have the best interests at heart, derailing the discussion with single slogan campaigns, etc., like big scary billboards that spread disinformation and crowd out the fact that this is not a perfect document, but that peace that can be then built upon in a non-binding deal is better than continued war. E.g., if there was a referendum in Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland, not necessarily popular because people who say terrorists had to be put in power. People came to terms with that. It's peaceful now, better than it was. Lots of good things happen on our side, none on the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good luck with those sorts of announcements tonight.